It's my pleasure to introduce David Peck, the moderator of this next session on the SDGs. We have an excellent panel here. David Peck is a writer, speaker, and award-winning podcaster who works at the intersection of storytelling, social change, and meaningful dialogue. We're very lucky to have him today. He's the host of Face to Face and a former host of Toronto Threads on 640 AM. And he's published over 650 in-depth interviews. This is somebody who, unlike the rest of us, he knows famous people too. But maybe through him we can meet some famous people. We're very lucky to have David, and I'm sure that he's going to be animating a very productive conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'll just wait for the applause to die down before I continue. Thanks. Thank you. I think it was Socrates who said the unexamined goal was not worth examining. Well, not quite, but close. And I think that's what we're here to do this afternoon. We're coming up on the end of our sessions here today, and honestly, I've been working in this field for many years and had the privilege of having so many conversations with students and practitioners and professionals. I've worked in many countries, and Cambodia is very near and dear to my heart. I've done a lot of development work there and learned so many lessons along the way. And I think the greatest lesson I think I've learned is that when you have a conversation, it requires that people listen. And I love that we're all here today, I hope doing that. And I think I can tell by the questions that have been out of the park as far as I'm concerned, for what it's worth. None of you, well, a few of you maybe know me, but it's been really remarkable. And I am thrilled and privileged to be here with Ruby and with Adam having this conversation about the SDGs and what they mean and where they're going. I mean, I don't know about you in the room, but I trust the ripple, and it's how I try to get out of bed in the morning. Doesn't always work. So right now, though, because I'm feeling like we're going to move into maybe some kind of call to action, and I think it's going to be implicit. It's going to be the dots that are connected by that thread. Pull a thread here and you'll find it's connected to pretty much everywhere else, right? And I think that that's what I'm hoping for. But I'm just kind of looking around the room right now to see whose sleeves are actually rolled up and who may have their metaphorical sleeves rolled up as well. So we're going to have a conversation here. This is what we're going to try to do, and we're going to step into some Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to opening up to the floor and trying to break down whatever this wall is up here that we may or may not have created. Please engage with us. And just before I introduce our speakers, how about, I'm going to miss somebody. I think Noah stood up for a reason. So I'm going to start with Noah. We've got Ted. We've got, I don't know where Joe is, Mode. There are so many others. I am, for crying out loud, up in the sound booth. How about a hand for everybody that's put so much time and effort into this conference here today? It really does take a large group of people to make something like this happen. It's really quite remarkable. It seems like it all falls into place, but it's so not true. Ruby Dagher is an international development professional. She's a researcher and a consultant. She's an assistant professor here at the university. She holds a PhD in public policy, and her work is focused on assessing the impact of the policy space, state capacity and evaluation methodologies, donor-recipient relationships, super important, power dynamics, economic development approaches in the global south. She has a new book coming out. You might want to ask her about that a little later on, and she's here with us today. She also has published and co-authored Reconstructing Our Understanding of State Legitimacy in Post-Conflict States. I had the privilege of having an in-depth conversation with her recently, and I'm super excited about what's next. Adam Sneyd not only is he a friend. He's also a professor of political science at the University of Guelph, where his research focuses on the politics of global development, commodities, and sustainability. He's the author of many books: Hidden Politics, one of my personal faves, Politics Rules, Power, Globalization, and Development. And guess what, folks? He's here with us today. How about a hand for our two guests? So I want to start out with just reading the blurb that went alongside of the talk here today. Goals, quote, goals for sustainable development and climate emissions reduction are utterly off track. Can and should the SDGs and climate goals be rescued? If so, what urgent actions are necessary to deliver meaningful progress for people and the planet and just and sustainable peace by 2030? Now, utterly off track, I think, speaks volumes. And aside from the fact that Stephen King said in On Writing that the road to hell was paved with adverbs, Adam, I'd love for you just to give us a few minutes on that. Ruby as well. How about we start with you, Ruby, as we step into this conversation here this afternoon?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation. So I think for me, what's really important, and it's something I did quite a bit of research on the SDGs and co-authored a book on the role of monitoring and evaluation in the SDGs, and we had a lot of discussions today that was super interesting about certain aspects of the SDGs, whether it's the financing part, whether, certain actors, what do we do, certain issues. But I think we should also, not meant to minimize all the other discussions, they're really important, but I think we should also question whether the SDGs are what we actually want. And I say this not because of how they're described. The SDGs are very laudable. I mean, who doesn't want zero poverty? Who doesn't want education for all? That's not the point. But when you actually look at who was involved, not in coming up with these goals, but in deciding how to get to these goals, how to achieve them, what to measure, what not to measure, then you start questioning, really, is this what we want to do? And so, for example, the conference about financing the SDGs, one question I would ask is, why are we in a financing an SDG crisis? And if we pull back and we look at the bigger picture, part of the reason why we are in a financing development crisis is because of the international system and how it's set up and the inequalities within the international system, and development is supposed to undo some of these inequalities. So then the question becomes, okay, is the issue really financing the SDGs, or is the issue really rethinking what the SDGs stand on as far as the system is concerned? What are they moving us towards, and how? And can we rethink them in a different way? So definitely zero hunger, definitely education for all, definitely health for all, but can it be achieved in a way that's different? And one of the things that I would say, again, because of the research that I've done, earlier we were talking, or somebody was talking about AI and the environment and talking about, there are some consequences, but the benefits are better. But then the question then becomes, if you look at it from an SDG perspective, there's one goal that's performing, but it's hurting the performance of another goal. And the SDGs are full of these contradictions. But then the question becomes, those people that are suffering, like, for example, even Americans within large cities or areas in the US that have zero access to water because of the AI data centers that are sucking all the water, these people are suffering. So then the question becomes, who gets to decide that they're worth paying the price for the benefits that AI gives us, for example, if we even were to go into that conversation? So I think it's more important for us to think about, what are these SDGs? How are we getting to where we're getting or supposed to go? What are the implications? Who's involved? Who decides? Who's paying the price? Are they contradicting each other? But moreover, I think what's even more important is this the system we want? Because is this something that actually will allow us to achieve the SDGs as they're defined largely? And I'll leave it at that.
It's a tough act to follow. And I think if we're thinking about urgent actions, one of the first things upon hearing Danny Roderick speak this morning that I walked out thinking about was, well, what's the role of the West in this? Like we're in Canada, we have a huge group here of well-intentioned people that are super interested in Canada's footprint in the globe. And how do we leverage that in a current context where there's a massive pushback against Western involvement and influence over systems across all of the global south? And I'll give you an example of Burkina, Mali, and Niger right now. I mean, this kind of alliance of the states of the Sahel is trying to essentially, these coup regimes have come together to unhook themselves from Western influence and kind of French neo-colonial, neo-imperial policy. And so that we can't think about urgent actions on the SDGs unless we're, like taking a look at ourselves in the West. What's our role? And actually asking that question. Similarly, we have to think about, well, what's the role of diplomacy when a UN is facing a 20% across the board budget cut? You might ring fence the LDCs, the small island developing states, and some of the landlocked countries from that budget cut, but that doesn't mean that the SDGs everywhere else aren't going to have that same kind of a problem. So we have this kind of an issue with what's the role of the West? And then, of course, belief is everywhere. Like this, we need to interrogate what our beliefs are and be open about that, because for many years, I'm looking at the SDGs since 2015. The challenge seems to be the belief that the framework that has been established to drive development, whether it's our own former development agency, Global Affairs Canada, whether it's across the world, how this is being integrated into domestic economies, this whole agenda has come together. The role of belief in that we're actually doing something that's positive, that we're actually doing something that's going to advance these really good sounding goals. I mean, I love the sound of the SDGs. I think about 16 or 17 of the goals sound great, but the framework to implement it is a choose your own adventure. It's a kid's book. You can basically say, here's where I want to go in this country. And you end up in really strange situations where particularly biodiverse hotspot countries might only focus on 3 targets of the land. For example, the land target SDG, at 15, you might only get a country which has huge, rich biodiversity that says we're only going to focus on 3 aspects of the most complex target under the SDGs, where there's a wealth of other indicators associated with it, but we're only going to focus on these 3 things. So yeah, I think we have an urgent need to address the role of diplomacy, the role of the West, and just this idea of belief, especially now with Trump. I mean, we're looking at in Canada this kind of nationalist pushback south of the border, and it's having this kind of global knock-on effect where this kind of sounds like Viktor Orban is happening all over the place, and the kind of that nationalism, and at the same time as we have a bunch of academics that are saying, wait a second, the SDGs aren't going far enough. And this is, I think, where we're kind of at. So yeah, David, thanks for getting us into the conversation a little bit.
Well, I'm hoping, Adam, maybe if we come back tomorrow, you're going to tell us how you really feel about all this stuff. So on one of the first development projects that I worked on was in Mongolia. It was a literacy program that CETA funded back in the day, many years ago. And it was coming out of a school project that I did when I did some of my postgraduate work. And I remember landing, and I have lots of stories, and didn't really like this country that I was coming to. And I've traveled to many since. I've been back a few times and kind of fallen in love with it for other reasons than just development, fallen in love with the people and so on and so forth. And I remember coming off the plane and seeing mining company signs for executives as I was coming down, and kind of almost terrified coming. As we were landing, it looked a little bit like a war zone. To the sides on the runway were parts of planes on the sides of the runway, as if they had maybe crashed and had been pushed off to the side to prepare for our landing. And thinking, what have I got myself into? And within a couple of days, heard a story. And Ruby, this is for you, because you used the word contradiction. And I was told about how locals were mining or benefiting from some of the mercury deposits that were being left behind from the gold leaching process and the parging and so on that was going on in the country. Can you talk about some of those layers? For instance, I'm just going to pack a few other questions in here. 17, why not 24? I mean, there's only 200, I checked this morning, according to the UN stats, there's only 234 indicators. What's so hard about that? And I think when you look at it, there's actually 251 listed, but only 13 are actually duplicated. I'm not even sure I understand the paragraph on the UN site. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about some of those layers, because that notion of what are the SDGs? How
Yeah.
can you even talk about something if we're presupposing that they're set, that we're well on our way, and I think we could all agree with a smile that we're maybe not quite there yet.
No, I think what we need to do is, before we get to talking about these contradictions, is to step back and actually see how they were done. And if you look at the way that the SDGs were put together, we say that they were very participatory, but in effect, they're not that participatory. They were not that participatory. They're still not that participatory. Because it's like when I used to work at Sneyd, every time we invited people to talk to us, because I was on the Middle East desk, I would set up an agenda in advance, and any other conversation that was outside the agenda, I'd write a small note and say, we'll get back to that later, and we'd never get back to that. So those were the SDGs. They had an agenda of what needed to be done. It fit the framework of the ideological system, and what people assumed were the right things to do. And then people were asked about these things. And again, it depended on whether the UNDP office was strong in that country, or if it wasn't strong in that country, who got to say stuff, whether people mailed their information in or not, whether the government agreed with the process or didn't agree with the process. So in some cases, we even delegitimized certain governments' decision-making on those. But what was really interesting was not that development, the development of the actual objectives and what people wanted, but it was the development of the indicators, as you suggested. There are too many of them. The idea of having 17 initially started off by saying we have to hope, and we have to change the world, and we need to tackle so many things. And the idea was that we can't let one go. And it was really answering some of the criticisms to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, as they were being put together. And the idea was that, it came out of also these discussions of intersectionality, in a sense where a problem is not just one thing. There's so many other factors that interact and work together to actually lead to that problem, or that we have to work on to lead to the solution. But the problem then became that when we had different working groups for the different goals, the working groups participants were ones that more or less aligned with the neoliberal government, international system government agenda. And so, for example, in the climate climate goal, initially we had people who criticized the significant capitalistic system and wanted to kind of slow down on the production. These people, with time, including indigenous actors from Latin America and North America, with time, these people were actually kicked off the working group and were replaced by some people who belong to certain industries, or who carry the discussions of certain industries. And then you started seeing the description of the indicators starting to change, and the description of the goals starting to change. And that's where the contradiction started. This is where it then seemed, it's really actually very difficult to have empowerment of women at the same time when you have a neoliberal system, an economic system that is increasing inequality. It's really hard to have no inequality when you're having a system that is causing environmental damage and destruction and climate, catastrophes. So the contradictions within these goals were because of every entity kind of using its power to move towards a certain type of an ideology. And these contradictions state and they remain. And I think the more important thing is there are some countries that are capable of filling these indicators. You mentioned the number of indicators. First of all, as a person who studies evaluation, the indicators are extremely subpar. That's not how you measure. They're badly written. They don't measure things properly. They don't have a proper direction. Some of them have descriptions that are unmeasurable. So to start off with, the indicators are horrible. Second, ideologically, if you look at what's under the indicators, you see that there's a certain tendency, whether it makes sense or not, that's not the point, that there's a certain tendency of how you measure certain things. But third, if you actually look, it's extremely difficult for so many countries around the world to be able to measure measure what's necessary to then provide a number to these indicators. And so the capacities of many of these countries, statistically speaking, institutionally speaking, even countries that don't know most of their populations, especially I'm talking about what we call fragile countries, or even other countries where the states have not expanded all of their territory. That's really hard. They don't have the capacity to do that. And so within the actual indicators themselves is a contradiction, because you're telling me we're succeeding or we're doing better, but the evidence is not there to tell me we're doing better. And so what you end up doing is you end up using the indicators that you can fulfill and that you can show that you're doing better on because you're being measured and you don't want to come out really low. So the research has shown that there's a lot of investment to prove that they're good, that they're better, that they're improving. And the indicators that show that they're not, or the ones that are contradictory to that statement, they're also being put aside. So the contradiction is happening in many different ways.
Adam, James Snyder in the intro to your book said that the SDGs were an elite project, I believe, to maintain the system, not to transform it. And I'm sure you agree with that. I'd love to hear, just your thoughts on some of the things Ruby has just said. And in a few moments, we'd love to open it up to the room. I'd love to open it up earlier, actually. And we haven't got any questions online, but please, if you do have anything online, please post those for us and we'll make sure we try to get to them.
Well,
But
Ruby, you're excellently summarizing some of the reasons that I actually said, okay, I need to sit down. I'm hearing all of these stories from differently situated academics, researchers, research scientists around the world, people who have been thinking very concretely about their specific area of expertise in relation to other areas of the SDGs. And as I started to read more of this with more time during the pandemic, I realized that I needed to actually sit down and write about the limitations of every single indicator of the SDGs, put it into a book, write about the problems with the targets that are above. I mean, you've got these, goals that sound great, and you have these targets that are underneath them that are just they're terms that are not defined all over the place, that are indicative of what Ruby was suggesting, a kind of ideological framework. And not only that, we have targets that don't look like they're connected or might be in contradiction with other targets under other goals. And then we have indicators that seem to be cherry picked and other possible indicators that were not included. So this is kind of the limitations of the framework. Now, with countries being able to select who evaluates them to say, we don't necessarily need to do this. It's a voluntary system. We can measure this and establish our own country system. It could be under the presidency. It could be under the prime minister's office. It could be under another ministry. And basically, that's the way it's going to be in that particular place. So we already have a cacophony of voices about what is going on with the SDGs. And we have a huge community of people around the world who have a direct vested interest in continuing to talk about the SDGs as something that's going to save the world. They're being able to fly to places to look at them and try to evaluate it. And I'm not trying to tear down the system in just stating the obvious. It's clearly the case. We have to pay more attention to belief. And that's what I was saying before. We need to question our own beliefs in our own areas, look at the limitations, and now's the time to build. Now's the time to build. If we want to actually fix multilateralism, the kind of things that you were talking about, the challenges of our current system, we need a different approach to thinking about this. And it might not be a popular thing to say, but I'm going to say it. We need global scientific collaboration on this topic. We need an actual pollination of a new framework for the post-2030 agenda that isn't controlled by diplomacy. It's not going to come from within the UN system. If we want to create a new framework for measuring sustainability and development, there are a whole bunch of ideas that were mentioned today already. The senator was talking about Kate Raworth's donut earlier. There's so many different approaches, and they're all separate, and people are hived off in their own areas. We need one vehicle to bring people together around fixing the problem that we're currently facing, which is that we don't talk about progress in the same kinds of ways. People aren't defining their terms. The way we're measuring this thing is not actually aligned with each other across borders, even in the same departments that study this stuff. We have to actually have a deep thinking exercise about where we want to go. So I guess it might not be popular. We need science. We need researchers. We need more collaboration to try to push this in a better direction so that we don't have 80% of the SDGs failing as they currently are.
And if I could just add to that, I think one of the things that's really, really, really missing is that we're looking at goals, goal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 17, but we're not looking at the long-term consequences of having all these goals together. So if we start to look at all of them together and we actually look at the long term, what it actually means, we'll see that many of the goals actually won't be achieved if we focus on achieving some of these goals, because they're in the long run doesn't work.
So you're not saying we shouldn't have the goals. It sounds like to me, it's a question of underlying assumptions. It's a question of participation, which is huge. It's about maybe building another table and maybe the people that we invite to it. Does that sound about right?
I mean, partly, yeah. It's about recently I did a workshop on decentering dominant voices in development. And one of the things that I highlighted was the difference between diversity and inclusion. And the diversity I was making reference to, I put up 2 pizzas. One is a cheese pizza and the other one is a cheese pizza with pepperoni. That's diversity. And then right after that, I put inclusion. And what I ended up putting was a pizza, shawarma sandwich, steak, a pasta. That's inclusion. It's when we're thinking of different points of view and not making sure that everybody's aligned with how we think or what we think. And honestly, we've gotten to a point where we're extremely uncomfortable with people who don't think like us. And we've become very intellectually lazy, not in developing new things and thinking about new things, but intellectually lazy in not wanting to interact with things that make us uncomfortable, that question some of our deep-rooted things. So it's not about throwing out the SDGs. Again, who would argue with zero poverty? Who would argue with education? Like, nobody would argue these things against, I'm hoping, nobody would argue against these things, right? But it's how you get there that needs to be reevaluated and reassessed.
So I'm wondering if Noah or somebody could grab a mic, and we do have a question, I think, or a comment right up here at table number 1, I believe, isn't it? I think right. So yeah, microphone is heading your way. So yeah, and then right up front here, no, if you don't mind. Yeah, I actually, based on what I'm listening to here, I'm not sure we needed a facilitator for this conversation.
Hi. Okay, I think it's easy after the fact to come back with a very critical analysis, but I think we have to revisit what was the process that led to these? How many groups were consulted? How many people were at those tables? How many different distinct tables of meetings do they have? And, you're trying to reach some kind of consensus. I mean, in this room, if we tried to reach a consensus on these, and we're pretty homogenous, and imagine you're having that consultation on the SDGs, which followed the MDGs and what was wrong with them. And so now we're doing the analysis of what's wrong with the SDGs, and you're going to have another kind of review, assessment process, whatever. So I don't know. I think it's a bit critical. There's probably a lot of fact to what you say, but I think you have to revisit where did it start and,
So if I could just answer that quickly, because I think we want to do question by question. I'll answer that quickly. In the book, we go through the details of who was invited to the table, but we also go through details of whose voice carried when invited to the table. And it wasn't a consensus. So for example, on the economic growth SDG, all of those who were invited were representatives of big companies. 90% of the big companies were from North America. And about 60% of those were involved in natural resources. That contradicts the SDG for climate change, related to climate change. Second, when it came to the NGOs, whose voices were heard, 90% of the participants of the NGOs were actually Western international NGOs based in the Western world. They filtered information that was provided by local NGOs according to specific criteria. These criteria were the only ones that were brought forward. The voices of the NGOs actually were tertiary, number 3, compared to the voices of the private sector, and then the foundations from the private sector. So I think you raise a good point in that it's really hard to come to a consensus. But if you actually look at how this decision was made, it was less consensus, more power.
And just, I think also to follow up on that, how it might sound critical now when everything is failing, when we have a total rejection from the United States over the soft governance agenda. We're all aware, we know that this is a huge challenge. The way that this was done and how Ruby has laid it out, how I've been looking at the problems that across every single one of the goals are replicated, what she's saying. I think the challenge is, what needs to be the focus of bringing people together? Is it about inclusion of all sorts of different non-governmental voices and private sector voices and government voices? Or is it actually about putting researchers in a room together who are studying all different aspects of society, whether it's economic historians, whether it's sociologists, anthropologists, whether it's geographers, political scientists, environmental economists, and on down the line into physics people who can think in 3 dimensions that are on that end of the natural sciences, and to actually have a conversation about, well, what's the state of the art of measuring these things, and can we cut out the contradictions? We're at a time where we actually have to think about this. We actually have the space to do it, and I think in a positive way, building something that was better than 2015, it's 2025, is absolutely possible and doable. And actually, we're proposing that people that are on this panel to try to do something about it. I don't know if we have any slides, or if there's any if there's a chance that we can get my slide deck.
We have a couple other questions here too. Nietzsche said in the subtitle of Twilight of the Idols, how to philosophize with a hammer, and it wasn't about smashing the idols. It was about testing them, as I'm sure many of you know, right? And I think I remember 35 years ago in a philosophy lecture on postmodernism, I was corrected. It wasn't about smashing them. It was about testing them. And that sounds to me like
Cracking.
and maybe cracking them. Mark, and then we have a question. Yeah.
Well, first, I'm sorry.
That's always so weird, right? It's tough
Okay.
perspective.
Go-
How about
go
you
for
go
it.
ahead?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name's Fawzia Moore. I worked for quite a long time with the various iterations of global affairs. And to date myself, I was one of the 5 young women who drafted the declaration that was seminal to the MDGs and then the SDGs. That was in the World Summit for Social Development, which of course was the first time that the eradication of poverty was mentioned. Who doesn't like eradication of poverty? Well, there's a story there that I could tell you, because at that point, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the department was very much divided between those who saw development and poverty eradication as incremental and therefore saw no reason for the summit declaration, and those who thought that it needed pushing. The original ideas behind the summit were not to, well, basically to look at poverty eradication, certainly, but also to include a lot of things like non-market-based work, which wasn't there just for gender, it was there for subsistence agriculture. The 2 development economists, myself and Liliani Kumaranayake, were very conscious that the IMF liberalization programs were affecting smallholder agriculture very deeply, and very much affecting the well-being of working people. So that's the first thing. Yes, there are things that are there now that would not have been there 30 years ago. The second issue is that the MDGs, in my view, were a rollback, because everybody got very concerned that we were going to be spending all our money on a wasted goal, eradicating poverty. So they rolled them back to education and health. My read of the SDGs is that, and I'm assuming it's government representatives in the end who actually had to sign off on those things, was that they were the third world or the developing world talking back and saying it's not just about health and education, it's about the financial system, it's about world trade and world economy and all the rest of it. If we're going to get there, you have to play nice. So from that point of view, I think the SDGs are progress, but they're big, they're messy, and they have too many indicators. I fully agree with you there. The other point in all of this is, and sorry, stop me if I'm taking up too much time here. You give me a big quizzical smile there. Should I shut up?
If you want to make your last point quickly, that would be great. Thank you.
What's not working is the international financial and economic system. It's not the SDGs. In Canada, for example, we have, a gendered foreign policy, but we have some of the highest protections against imports from gendered industries in the world. We're just behind India. We, in the West, have not taken the decisions and have not the reforms necessary to help the current global economy move forward. And until we do that, we can talk all we want about what's advisable and what isn't, but we need to start by looking at home and finding out what we need to do. And I would say the same thing for development finance as well. Thank you.
So thank you for that. I think there are a lot of really good points there. There are a few things I just want to touch back on in a sense where our research shows that yes, national politicians had to approve certain things, and there was a bit of a pushback, but the pushback was very minimal. That was actually integrated, and you can see that because, for example, they pushed really hard on goal 17. Very little of what they suggested was integrated in goal 17. So there was little integration. There was, sorry, who took it out? Mostly the bigger players and the donors and the Western countries who decided that that was a no-go. There's one Danish politician who actually wrote about this and talked about how the negotiations were really, really, really tough and how they were completely ignored in many cases. So I would say that. I would also say that in many ways you're right. So that example that you gave about gendered sectors. So one example I would give, and we were talking about this earlier, and our senator was talking about it, and I would say it this way. Green technology is great, except green technology displaces environmental damage. In a sense where for you to get a solar panel, you need natural resources that are found in a lot of African countries that are dug up, that cause massive environmental damage for the benefit of here us having green technology and quote unquote saving the world. That's a contradiction in the SDGs, for example, right? So we have to think from a bigger picture. And I would take what you said, which is, yes, it's our economic system, but also to recognize that the SDGs were informed by the ideology of our current economic system. So that's why we need to question a lot of things that are in the SDGs if we are concerned with our current economic system.
Just go through a couple of the challenges. The Canadian government under Stephen Harper fought the inclusion of SDG 12 in the responsible consumption and production, ultimately being measured as the production of corporate sustainability reports under the SDGs, under SDG 12. Okay, so the volume of corporate reporting goes up, and apparently magically that means that corporate practices equally go up in the direction of more responsibility and sustainability. Of course, that's nonsense. SDG 10, you'd think on inequality would have focused on the wealth inequality challenge. There's actually no language in the SDGs about wealth inequality, the Zuckman tax notwithstanding. Infrastructure, SDG 9 doesn't talk about anything related to sustainable production, life on land or underwater. It just talks about the need to put a paved road near people. The paved road can be the source of the destruction, and it doesn't seem to occur in the framework that might be a contradiction. Political narratives on green growth dominate SDG 8, and there's a huge scientific debate, primarily in Europe, especially based in Barcelona, but also at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and people are talking about the need to think about what sectors should we be growing, what things should we not be growing. Is there something here? We don't even know in Canada what's the global environmental footprint of our consumption from abroad, and domestic material consumption. We also don't have any updated data on, and the SDG indicators that are contradictory. I can go through, but we got to get some more questions.
Mark, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, thanks. And first I want to apologize because at home I always criticize the old white man that keeps mansplaining. And here I am with my third intervention. So apologies, everyone. But for me, this is really foundational. It's part of my DNA, these conversations. So I have to intervene. My wife would slap me, but that's... first point, and I can't believe I'm saying this, the SDGs were a compromise and a global compromise. And we know that any situation which is really a democratic process always sidesteps, sensitive issues, et cetera. And for me, as an implementer of the SDGs on behalf of the government, I see them more as a storyline and a headline. Because if we don't have the SDGs, what do we have, right? We need a hook. And there are also all sorts of other hooks. But I think as a headline, the SDGs work. That's my take. And I was hoping that this conversation would have been a bit more optimistic instead of sort of looking at the current architecture. And it's a mess, granted, but what are the little hopes that we have? And then the other piece, and this is really ingrained in my own being, what is Canada's role going forward? What do we stand for? And what can we mean? Can we lead? Right? Because I firmly believe that we can. As a human being, not as a public servant, as a Canadian, I think we can. We have a lot to offer. And that's the conversation we need, because we need key leaders. We need that charismatic leadership, which we don't have. I'll stop there.
No, it's great. I
This is,
mean, I
this
could
is
say there's a
perfect.
moral obligation almost at
So
the risk of
we
being
want to be
descriptive.
positive and we want to actually build something. And I think it's a great segue into what we've been working on over the past year. Coming out of writing this book on the SDGs, I realized that I had to do something. It was an angry book. You could ask my life partner over there, wife Lauren, about how angry it was to go through and look at all of the implications of the compromise that was this diplomatic compromise. Okay, can we take it out of the hands of diplomacy? Can we in Canada lead an effort to actually bring researchers together to design a better framework that's inclusively done, but basically driven by experts? And then can that be brokered to statistics agencies that are still using legacy statistics? We're talking about 20th century measures of progress. Remember, GDP was new once. It doesn't come from nowhere. So we need new ways of thinking. So this is why we've basically been trying to think about, can we create an independent commission independently of the United Nations that actually assesses not only the failures of the SDGs, but proposes to reinvent the framework itself. So I've been talking, can we redesign the Sustainable Development Goals with clear measurable targets? Can we have some sort of pulling out of the politics that's been built into it and the lack of definitions? Can we have better indicators where we have scientific conversations about, does this make any sense, instead of having the compromise saying, well, here's the gold standard, and now let's broker this back to countries and see if statistics agencies can get with the program. So we've been working in the background, a couple of folks. So Thierry Zumahun, who's he's got an experience with the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences and the Next Einstein Forum, and a few other folks. This didn't switch. Sorry, I got to switch this myself. There we go. I'm just move forward right through to here. Okay, so these folks, so Thierry has a vast experience as a CEO of knowledge-based organizations. He heard, read my book and heard me talk about this on David Peck's show, and basically said, Adam, we got to do something. And so he basically came up with a strategy for how we might actually be able to create an organization that could bring people together to reinvent the SDG wheel. Jason Dudek is a Canadian rice investor, and he's involved with something called Sky Canoe, which is a cargo drone company. It's an indigenous business, and he has a lot of experience in Sierra Leone and other parts of the African continent. And his partner, Samir, is a Tunisian author and the first Tunisian graduate of the University of Cambridge. So we came together and said, let's actually try to do something with this idea. Let's develop a strategy. And then in the midst of that, as I went around and started to talk, we basically ended up with a whole bunch of other people that have jumped in on this. So we've got folks who are basically public relations experts, people who are on this slide, sociologists, economic historians, people who've been looking at the gender goal in particular, geographers, critical accountants, people who have challenged the limits of statistics in Africa, Morten Jervin, and others from around the world. And in Canada, Ryan Briggs, my colleague, and Ryan Katz-Rosen, who's here in Ottawa, people who are basically saying, you know what, we actually are buying into the notion that we could maybe we can have a hive mind of folks to actually rethink this and then broker it back. So we're in the process of trying to make some big asks for some funding to bring people together to rethink this at this time. And obviously a lot of American colleagues have been reaching out to me and saying, yeah, maybe I want to get involved because things aren't so wonderful. So we're trying to capacitize this and in a positive way say, you know what, let's actually do something with the scientists and researchers first instead of the diplomacy first, and see what comes out the other side for sustainable development. And can we actually make that happen in our world? I hope so. People are looking for something to do. So a lot of my colleagues that are looking to not just throw stones at a problem, we actually want to have a purposeful solution. Can you get a measurable results framework that's aligned with each other? Can we pull out some of this politics? I mean, stats are always political, but we can do better than we have. We can and must do better.
And I think if I would just get back to one of the points you made, I would have loved it to be democratic. It wasn't. When you have in a working group, when you have 10 out of the 12 that are from the US, 1 from Canada, Europe, and have a certain way of thinking, and 2 that are kind of saying, hold off a minute, that's not democratic. When you have that's why I talked about diversity versus inclusion. It wasn't democratic. And if it was democratic, I wouldn't be as critical right now, because that means that it was actually grassrootsy, came out of something that everybody negotiated together. In any negotiation, there's a give and take. That's how we live our lives, and we should, because otherwise it would be chaos. But it wasn't democratic. And we're hoping that this will give the space for voices to be equalized in a way where we bring the knowledge, the capacity, and then that not one voice overtakes another voice, and that negotiation can be done in a more or less democratic fashion that was missing from the SDGs.
So we have a question over here from table 2, I believe.
So I was just wondering, not to sound too pessimistic, but what you think the likelihood is for states to sort of commit to a new agenda and new initiatives and be willing to make that global compromise post 2030, just with the influence and the commitment to international cooperation decreasing quite a bit.
Okay, so there was once upon a time when I was very small. I wasn't really cognizant of this stuff. My first political memory is Ed Broadbent on a soapbox on Bay Street. And so in 1984, before this time, the former West German chancellor, a guy named Willy Brandt, was basically called up by the then president of the World Bank, my understanding, Robert McNamara, said, we've got a problem. There's a huge conflict in international development. The West isn't talking to the rest at the United Nations. There was this whole new international economic order push within the United Nations to make the global trading system work better for developing countries that was floundering. There was not a lot. I mean, there was the context of the aftermath of OPEC. There was a divide. It was a very difficult situation. My understanding, not having lived very much through the 1970s, was that people keep talking about this a lot. So we go back to that point, and Willy Brandt was asked to launch an independent commission, independently of the UN system, independently of the UN choosing who would sit on this thing. They were, let's actually write a report. It sold 1 million copies. They went around the world and tried to broker this. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a big fan of this and absolutely was pushing that, but by the time Ronald Reagan got to a Cancun summit on international development issues, it was kind of looking like a lot of the ideas weren't going to be taken up. That said, many people involved in the Brundtland Commission subsequently drew upon Brandt's analysis and used it. So the idea of the independent commission, I think, is there as a backstop where you say, okay, the multilateral system, not a lot of states are going to want to take a risk on this right now. This is why we're looking into innovative finance. We're looking for partners that are coming from different places, warm givers. We're looking for warm givers rather than the traditional sources, because I think to have a truly independent voice on the system malfunction and a way of measuring it to move forward, we might need to basically cut it out. The multilateral system isn't going to save itself. It's not going to put up a new way of measuring development that actually is aligned with itself in this current moment. Yeah.
But you also see certain countries making decisions to follow certain goals and not others, adjusting certain goals, adapting it to what. So it's not like there's no space. And there is this openness in understanding more and more, and this critical view more and more by other countries about what is actually happening and trying to find their footing within it. So it's not like it's fully closed, that there is no, again, it's that hammer that causes the crack rather than the complete break. And so, with that information that's being provided and that backstop that Adam was talking about, there is right now some willingness and some sort of openness, if you want, to look at things at least a little bit differently.
I think we have a question right here at table 3.
Yeah, thank you. This is very interesting. My name is Louise Ouimet. I've spent my career working in international development and 10 years in Mali and Burkina Faso. At the end of the day, the countries need to provide their own development plans. What I have seen in my career is that the UN staff, UNDP mostly, were insisting on getting the data on the progress of the SDGs. So actually what really happened was that those departments of finance or planning, wherever it was, would set up a specific bureaucracy to fill that report once a year, while the actual management of the, development plan and so on was somewhere else. But, well, same department sometimes, but they're completely different people working in silos. Maybe that was their problem. But basically, how do you ensure ownership, of whatever? I like your idea of how you want to set up the new post 2030 SDGs, but how can you ensure ownership?
So this is hard to say for a group of ex-diplomats and people Canadians, what can we do for Canada? So please don't hang me once I finish saying this. But I think one of the really important things is that donors have to humble themselves a little bit. It's not about how Canada can save this country or what Canada can do for this country. It's really about allowing the space for that country to actually be able to get the decision making. A lot of times, given again capacity, what we call capacity issues, or what we call funding, or whatever it is, however you want to call it, a lot of times what that actually means is actually giving these people access to the information. It's actually giving these people access to experiences from other places, to know what worked in other places, what didn't work in other places, what exists, what doesn't exist, instead of saying, here, you should be doing this. It's more of, here, I will help you by informing you of all these things, but it's your ownership. You have to do what is best for you, and I can't dictate it to you, especially since I don't fully know everything that's happening. It doesn't mean that one of the things that I always fear is that people assume that what we're suggesting is the Western world doesn't do anything. Quite the contrary, the Western world has to do a lot. One is this huge international system is more or less controlled, guided, whatever, by a lot of the Western countries plus some other big ones. And so there is a role there to do. But the other role as well is that, we have a lot of knowledge. It's not the perfect knowledge. There's no one single truth. But the information that we're providing can help inform them. And it's less about imposing, and it's more about it's more about giving them access to stuff that otherwise they won't have access to, and have this exchange of information. Honestly, we can learn from them. I'm Lebanese of origin. I can't tell you how many times, and I used to work on the Middle East desk, I can't tell you how many times I've learned from other people that are not Canadian. And I continuously learn from my students in classes, especially students who don't come from the Western world. There is that exchange that needs to happen, and that's really what's missing. It's happening within specific agendas, discussions, ideas, limitations. What we're suggesting is that we have more of these wider.
So believe it or not,
relations.
we only have time for one more question. And I think it's right over here from table number 4.
Sweet. Okay, so I was reading a piece by Dr. Danny Roderick earlier in preparation for this day, and one of the points that he makes is that there's certain policy areas where the returns of global governments they basically diminish. And I was wondering, since the topic we've talked a lot about democracy in the process of developing the SDGs, but if you were to narrow the scope of the SDGs, what goes? Are there places right now where we're seeing massive inefficiencies? Because we did, the point was made, however many minutes ago, that why are we addressing them all at once? And I definitely appreciate that, but I also wonder about the complexity of the problems.
We have 2 minutes to answer this question.
This is a complexity challenge, right? And so nobody's saying that the cleanup crew that we're proposing is going to have a master narrative that everybody would follow. But the idea would be that we can actually have goals, targets, and indicators that don't cross each other out, different pathways that you could take. If you have this definition of this term, this is your pathway. Here's your adventure. Here are your statistics. If you have this other definition, here is the target that it might contradict. Here's another way of managing that target. So basically, it's not at a level of complexity necessary to actually get change going in the right direction. The indicators are not deep enough. The targets are not robust enough, and they cancel each other. So what we can do is provide pathways using new technologies. We were here talking about artificial intelligence. I'm not opposed to thinking about ways that we might be able to find, that future in our conversation. So I think, yeah, we want to have hope. We want to have better ways of measuring and talking about progress instead of just thinking, we made an SDG here and it's good. I think we can get a little deeper.
And if I could just add one small thing, that filtering is already happening. There's not one single country that is not a Western country that's doing all of the SDGs. So that filtering, whether we want 17 goals or 16 or 15, or we think it's better or not, their capacity and their desires are leading them to focus on certain and not others. So it's not us that are filtering. We're not saying choose this or that. It's the capacity that's leading to this. So we're just trying to figure out what happens if. you choose this?
So on Monday, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of working with the International Campaign to Ban Landmines on a short 10-episode series called Silent Killers, a podcast that's coming out, that's already out, about disarmament and anti-landmines. And I often will say it's about landmines, and it kind of is, but in a kind of ironic, paradoxical fashion. And Lloyd Axworthy is our guest on Monday. And he ended the interview by talking, and he was very critical of our current government and previous government. Wonderful guest, by the way. I'm sure many of you know him here, and his book, Navigating a New World. I mean, I don't know if you can get more hopeful, but he ended with the notion of radical hope, relentless radical hope. And I know that kind of sounds crazy maybe at an academic conference on a certain level, but I see some heads shaking, and that gives me goosebumps, and it gives me a little bit of hope as we step into our, I guess, final conversation. How about a hand for everyone that participated and for our two guests? Thank you.